Hello and welcome to Point of View. I'm John Watson. Today we're going to be talking to two different guests about two different topics. First up, we'll be talking to Phil Goff about his Overseas Investment Amendment Bill, and secondly we'll be talking to Bruce Wills about any concerns Federated Farmers has with the possibility of a Labour Green-led coalition government this year. Phil Goff's Overseas Investment Amendment Bill would change the Overseas Investment Act 2005 to make it tougher for foreigners to buy farmland of more than 5 hectares. It would substantially limit the sale of rural land and would ensure that only rural sales bringing substantial new jobs or exports would be approved. But is it needed? Is the Overseas Investment Act of 2005 sufficient as it is? Well, we spoke to Phil Goff and asked him. Mr. Goff, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Your bill is an amendment to the Overseas Investment Act of 2005. Can you tell us, why isn't the Overseas Investment Act sufficient as it is?
Well, the Overseas Investment Act of 2005 was brought in with the purpose of setting a certain threshold before you could buy New Zealand rural land. Unfortunately, and I have to say successive governments, both Labour and National, haven't sufficiently enforced the provisions in that bill. So what my bill does is set out with greater clarity that before we sell off any land to overseas investors, to foreign investors, there has to be clear benefit to New Zealand, and I spell out what that clear benefit is.
Because there are stipulations and provisions in the Overseas Investment Act that when foreigners buy land here or invest, it has to have substantial economic and other benefits to New Zealand and New Zealanders. You're saying that at the moment, though, the ministers just aren't adhering to those stipulations enough.
I'm saying that government ministers have not sufficiently used their discretion so as to substantially limit the sales where there is no clear benefit from overseas investors owning the land as against New Zealanders owning and operating that same land. Why am I doing that? I'm doing that because I think it is critically important that we don't become tenants in our own land. Even John Key admitted that that was a concern. But still we're seeing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hectares of rural land continuing to be sold off to overseas investors without adequate provision that they are benefiting New Zealand because of it. We want them here if they can benefit New Zealand. We don't want them here if they're simply coming to speculate in a country that has no capital gains tax. People coming, whether it's from Birmingham or from Hong Kong, are unlikely to have the expertise New Zealanders have as farmers. They need to demonstrate that they're bringing something special if we're to see ownership of New Zealand land pass to somebody who doesn't even live here.
So it would give the minister less wiggle room, if you will.
It means that the minister will have to be absolutely explicit about the sort of benefit that New Zealand might derive. It's not aimed at any particular country. It will apply to any overseas investor. It obviously won't apply to any person from, regardless of what their ethnic origin is, who is living in New Zealand as a New Zealand resident or citizen.
I suppose what I'm trying to ascertain is there are the stipulations in the Overseas Investment Act, but are you saying that ministers aren't adhering to those?
We still saw in 2011, after the national government had supposedly tightened this act up, nearly 7% of New Zealand agricultural land being sold to overseas investors.
Is that Shanghai Pung's in?
Well, no, that was prior to that. There are a range of Shanghai Pungshin is a prominent example because it was the biggest sale of dairy land, 8,000 hectares, in New Zealand's history. But there are lots of other examples. Harvard Endowment Fund, for example, also in the same year bought something like 1,300 hectares. You've really got to ask this question. You know, maybe anybody could farm better than Mr. Crayfer was farming his land, but why wasn't the Crayfer farms made available to a range of young Kiwis seeking to achieve the Kiwi dream of becoming a farmer in this country?
But New Zealanders couldn't come up with the amount of money that Shanghai Pung's in could to buy these farms.
If you sold it as one block, there was no reason why the Crayfer farms could not be sold as individual farms. Then there'd be a dozen or a score young Kiwi couples realising that dream of being able to farm their land in New Zealand and contribute to New Zealand and to their families in that way. It's really hard today for young people wanting to go out and to become farmers to actually be able to afford to pay for that land. It's harder still when they're bidding against overseas purchasers who are often got credit lines at a much cheaper rate than young New Zealanders could borrow the money in New Zealand. It's not a level playing field, it's loaded against young New Zealanders.
Do you have any specific examples of foreign land sales that you find most concerning?
No, look, I haven't picked out particular examples. You know, I'm not in the position to actually go to a farm and ask to see their books to show what they've done. But the Overseas Investment Office certainly is, and I want the Overseas Investment Office to be in no doubt at all that the threshold is a very high threshold. I want to see a substantial reduction in the falling out of New Zealand ownership of New Zealand agricultural land. It's not just what is owned overseas at the moment. We're living in a food short world. We're living in a world where there is huge demand to come in and buy up our land to ensure security of food supply. I don't want to see huge amounts of land being sold overseas. That's why we need to act now to prevent what I think will be a rapid increase in the sale of New Zealand farmland unless we act.
Because foreign investment has had benefits in New Zealand, you can't deny that. In the wine industry, for example, 70% is owned by foreign investors, but they've doubled the production in the last 5 years, and they've established our Sauvignon Blanc reputation worldwide. Wouldn't the sheep and beef and the wool sectors benefit from this type of an investment and the kind of production that we've seen in the wine industry?
Well, let me just first make a comment on the wine industry. I think it was Kiwis that developed Sauvignon Blanc, not the overseas investors that subsequently bought up the vineyards. It was Kiwi expertise and our growing conditions that did that. But look, your point is right. That's why my bill does not simply, as maybe the Green Party would want to do, put a blanket exclusion on foreign ownership. If that foreign investment brings clear benefit to us, yeah, we'll support that. If it doesn't, we're not going to approve the application. What I'm asking for actually is nothing more than common sense. If it's good for New Zealand, we'll do it. If there is no benefit and there is a significant downside, as I've already spelt out, why would we do it?
Playing the devil's advocate though, if a foreigner does buy farmland here, they're farming on it, they're exporting, they're paying tax and they're employing locals. What's the problem with that?
Well, because in buying the land, they are outbidding New Zealanders who could do equally as well, and we would have the opportunity for young New Zealanders to become farmers and to contribute to their own country. I don't want to live in a country where more and more of our land, our precious resource, is owned by people who are out of our country and who don't have the same commitment that we as New Zealanders have to ensuring that that land is used properly for our benefit and with the protection of the environment and the wider considerations that need to be made in terms of land ownership.
Would you say foreigners don't have that commitment, the same commitment that New Zealanders would have?
Obviously, if you're going to sell any land at all to overseas purchasers, you need to have quite rigid consents that they have to meet, because we don't want people coming in here and using New Zealand as something that they can exploit for its resources without care for what the quality of our environment and our land is now and in the future. So those consents need to be there, but yes, they can come in and they can farm the land, they can hire a manager so that you've got the land owned and the New Zealanders' only role is to manage the land. But why wouldn't we want to give the opportunity to young New Zealanders to do what generations of people have done, that is buy their own piece of land and farm it effectively and efficiently?
And part of that, as you say in your explanatory note, is not allowing New Zealand bidders to be outbid by foreign investors. But what about property rights? What about the rights of farmers to sell their land to the highest bidder?
Well, I've had that discussion, in fact, just the other day with Bruce Wills from Federated Farmers, because he'd raised that as a concern. And he acknowledged to me that, look, there are a lot of people within Federated Farmers and even more New Zealanders who say, Well, it's one thing for somebody to say, look, I can flog off my land and I can make a big profit, and the fact that it's overseas owned now is just none of anybody else's business. I think that's really short-sighted. That's really narrow.
Well, do you think then that farmers should be compensated for the amount of money they'd lose out on the sale if they were to sell to a New Zealander rather than a foreign buyer?
No, I don't see us getting into paying compensatory payments. Look, we have a market in New Zealand, but that market will be defined predominantly by what New Zealanders can afford to pay and will pay for that land. It's not in our interests economically either to see the value of productive land inflated beyond what its productive worth actually is. We have this huge problem in New Zealand that economists are talking about at the moment, including both urban and rural land, that the value of land is just rising far faster than in other countries. And when that bubble bursts, that's going to have enormous and negative economic consequences for New Zealand. We don't want to see that bubble created and worsened by overseas investors.
But this speculation is happening in the Auckland property market, even in Invercargill. Why should farmers be targeted here, but not Auckland property owners or even Wellington businesses?
I think that's a good point. I think that the rules should apply equally in terms of rental properties, because the property bubble that I've just talked about applies even more so in the urban environment.
I suppose my question is then, why is this bill only targeting rural land and not land across the board?
I've focused in this area, but I know my colleague Phil Twyford, who's our spokesperson on housing, and you know from the announcement of Labor policy that we're also intending to move on overseas investors buying up existing rental properties. If they want to come and build a house and create an asset that adds to the supply of housing, we wouldn't have problems with that. But if they want to buy into the existing rental market, and their actions are only serving to force up the price of properties for first home buyers, what benefit is there to New Zealand? And ultimately that's the test. I'm a New Zealand politician. My obligation is to you and to New Zealanders not to make life easy for overseas investors who aren't adding value or benefit to New Zealand. If they do add that value, then there's a purpose for their investment and we would allow it. If they don't, we should stop it.
Mr. Goff, thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much. It's been good to be on the show today.
Well, stick around after the break. We'll be talking to Federated Farmers President Bruce Wills about any concerns he has about the possibility of a Labour Green coalition government later this year.